Well, last week, the Oklahoma Supreme Court dealt a huge blow to national reparations efforts, and in particular to the case of the survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, the two surviving uh, individuals, survivors of the massacre, both in their 100s, both 100-plus-year-old, who were seeking to get compensation for the trauma, the destruction of property, the destruction, the burning out of their community. Well, the Oklahoma Supreme Court somehow thought they were asking for a handout, or that they somehow had nothing to do with the events of 1921, because they wrote that simply being connected to a historical event does not provide a person with unlimited rights to seek compensation, as if these 100-year-old women were seeking compensation simply because they were connected to the event, rather than being victims of the massacre, rather than being individuals who were directly harmed by the events of that massacre. It just goes to show how the lengths, I should say, that Republicans and conservatives will go to distort the truth, distort facts, and marginalize the impact of targeted racial attacks on Black communities. Really insulting language in this decision by the Oklahoma Supreme Court. I've been talking with many of the lawyers that were involved in that case, those lawyers expressing that this could be the end of the road for these 100-year-old plus survivors. But I have to believe that their story is not going to end with this distorted and somewhat disconnected opinion from the Oklahoma Supreme Court. So in this hour, we're going to be talking with Dr. Karlos Hill. Again, he was with us in hour one, but he is a historian. He is an African-American professor in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, and he's been intimately involved in this lawsuit. He's worked with the parties. He's worked with the legal team. He's worked with the community. So he has his finger on the pulse of what's happening in Tulsa. And also, I hope to have in this hour a pastor named Robert Turner, who now is in Baltimore, but was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and was actually one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit. He was dismissed early on before the case went up on appeal, but he too has been working on issues of reparatory justice around the country. So when we come forward, we're going to talk about this case that all of us in the legal community were looking to, hoping that the Oklahoma Supreme Court would get it right. Well, it didn't, but that's okay. We're used to losing fights and winning battles. And it's my prediction that this is one that we also will win. We got to be creative, but we are going to continue to fight and lift up the victims and the survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre, as well as victims and survivors of racially targeted attacks all over this country. So stay with us. Very interesting, very important conversation to be having, particularly on the eve of Juneteenth. Thank you, Professor Hill, for hanging out and staying around, doing double duty tonight. Really appreciate it. Your voice is so important on this issue because you're still in Tulsa. And thank you, Pastor Turner, for your voice and the work that you've done, not just in Tulsa, but also in Baltimore, where you continue to lead the charge on reparations. But let me start with you, Karlos. What is the mood of the city? Take us to Tulsa. I saw this scathing op-ed that was written by one of the Black Wall Street Times editor-in-chief, just expressing the outrage and the emotion. So talk to us about what the community in Tulsa is feeling right now.
Well, Areva, thank you again for having me in the second hour. You know how much I love Greenwood, how much I love the community. I can't say how the community as a whole is feeling, but I'm going to tell you how I feel. I'm going to tell you about how the people that I'm in support of in Tulsa would feel. It's deflated. This has been 103-year long struggle for justice, and no justice for any victim, descendant, or survivor connected to the massacre. The deadliest attack on a Black community has happened, although whites, particularly white store owners, have received restitution. And so it's the injustice in Greenwood and Tulsa is so glaring, so even unprecedented, that the deadliest attack on a Black community, white individuals, white businesses even receive restitution. And the last two survivors, we actually have survivors of the incident, right? And we, in Oklahoma law, a public nuisance law that's supposed to be about compassion, we don't have compassion for the deadliest attack on a Black community and the two remaining survivors, right? And so there's a sense of deflation, but that's not the end of the story. And I would gladly talk about the things that I think might happen, but I know Pastor Turner, who I love and respect, has much more to say about what the community would be feeling.
Yeah, thank you for that, Karlos. Deflated, I think, is a good word. Pastor Turner, what are you feeling, or what did you feel? What were your initial reactions when you got the news about how the court had ruled?
It was stunning. Areva, first of all, thank you again for having me back, and always a pleasure to be in the midst of Dr. Karlos here, a great scholar and friend. When I was the pastor at Vernon, I was the one who reached out to Attorney Simmons to try to represent the church because we still had standing. And so Vernon was the original plaintiff in the lawsuit. And they, after I left, they took us off as the plaintiff. The defense objected to us being a plaintiff, and the judge upheld that. And every so often they would take off plaintiffs, and for them to be the last two, the survivors, to be left as plaintiffs, and to see what their Supreme Court, because those plaintiffs live still in Oklahoma, and to see what their Supreme Court did to them, it's an embarrassment to what we call a just and civil society. That you could have a society where airplanes were used to drop bombs on American soil. Nobody goes to jail. And at the same time, this country is sending money overseas to help other folks defend themselves, such as the Ukrainians, to defend themselves against the Russians dropping bombs on their soil. So we can have money to support, and we don't mind supporting them, but we can't even do justice in our own backyard. It's a glaring example of the hypocrisy of our unjust system and society. And we have the two oldest survivors left, and they unfortunately will not receive justice from their own state as far as this lawsuit is concerned. It's very troubling.
Yeah, so the court noted, Professor Hill, and you're there in Tulsa, it said the continuing blight alleged within the Greenwood community born out of the massacre implicates generational society inequities that can only be resolved by policymakers. That's such a deep statement. That statement is what we hear repeated so often. And to break that down, I mean, it's a lot of big words to basically say, the folks that did that ain't here now, so why should we pay for what they did? I mean, and that's what we often hear when you talk about reparations. I just posted something on my own social media page about Palm Springs. I did an interview, the case I'm working on in California, and someone went on my page and wrote a comment and said, oh, that happened 60 years ago. Everybody's dead. Why should we be responsible? And that's what the court is basically saying. Yeah, Black folks are living in poverty. There's blight in Tulsa, and it might be related. We know it is related, but they're saying, we're not responsible for that. The government really shouldn't be responsible for that. Help us understand how that argument gets used whenever we're talking about repairing harm done to Black folks. Don't hear that. Same argument, though, when others have been successful in seeking and obtaining reparations.
It's Black harm. We have a statute of limitations. When it's Black harm, it's personalized. It's got to be connected directly to you as a victim. We got to be able to prove you are a victim. It becomes legalistic. And in legal courts, we don't win. We just don't win in courts, because by the time our claims can get to court, they will say statute of limitations. And so, but when it comes to other people's harm happening to them, racial violence happening, or just, things, acts of nature, happening, those things are seen as institutional violence, right? And institutional violence gets treated differently, right? And the problem for us is that the Greenwood as a community was destroyed. An institution was destroyed. Greenwood was destroyed, but miraculously rebuilt itself without the support, the help of the state or the city. And so when we talk about the harm that was done, it's not just the survivors. We need justice for the two survivors, but Greenwood as a community is a survivor too. As an institution, it survived without the support and help of the city. And so what we're talking about is the same community that deserves repair as an institution. The city has not found the compassion for it or the survivors. And so that's where we are, like fighting against the indifference and the lack of compassion for the community and the survivors.
And one of the things, Pastor Turner, and again, this is a statement from some of the local officials in Tulsa, which you know because you were there pastoring a church. State and local officials argue that while the massacre was horrific, they should not be held accountable for events that happened decades ago, over 2 days in 1921. We just hear that argument over and over again. Again, not just in the Tulsa case, and reparations actions and efforts all over this country, this notion that somehow somebody else is responsible and that somebody else is dead. The one-sidedness of that argument, not ever recognizing that those that benefit from those racial atrocities are still living today and reaping the benefits. No recognition that the wealth that white communities have been able to build is because of land, oftentimes that was stolen by Blacks, and opportunities that were stolen from Blacks. So nobody ever talks about, well, I shouldn't have these benefits today because, they were taken illegally or they were gained illegally by my ancestors decades ago. So it's such a one-sided argument, but we hear it over and over again. And a lot of people believe that it has legitimacy. And it sounds good on its face. Well, why should I pay for something that I didn't do? How do you respond when people make that argument to you?
Well, because the person that actually did it still exists, right? And they're allowed to go on still exists. The city of Tulsa still exists. The city of Tulsa that largely saw and was at worst complicit, at best a conspirator, an actor in the worst massacre in American history. The Tulsa Fire Department still exists. That didn't put out one fire. In fact, documented eyewitness reports state they watched the houses and churches be burned to the ground. Sinclair Oil Company, the company whose airplanes were used to drop incendiary devices on churches' homes that destroyed 1,256 homes in 18 hours, they still exist to this very day. So those actors are still present. So they are still there. The problem.
Hold that thought for me, Pastor Turner. I definitely want to get into that because that's a myth, as you said, that these folks aren't still around, because they are. It's important to note that Charles Ogletree, deceased now, but a renowned civil rights attorney, someone who I had the really great privilege and honor of studying under at Harvard Law School, went into Tulsa in the early 2000s, and he filed a lawsuit in federal district court in 2003. That lawsuit against the city and state of Oklahoma claimed civil rights violations and said the state's typical 2-year statute of limitation on filing such cases shouldn't apply because he said there was a vast cover-up in the aftermath of the riots. That case was taken all the way to the Supreme Court by Professor Ogletree, or the late Charles Ogletree, and other esteemed attorneys, including the late Johnny Cochran. Ultimately, the Supreme Court dismissed that lawsuit. So the new attorney, Demario Simmons, knew that there was no avenue in the courts using federal civil rights statutes. He knew what happened in the case of the earlier civil rights lawsuit filed by Charles Ogletree and Company. So he used the public nuisance, which is a state statute in Oklahoma, hoping that he would find some judicial relief there. And the Supreme Court said no. There's an interesting statement, though, Professor Hill, that the city government issued after the ruling. One, they said they'd respect the court's decision, but that they would continue to work with the community of Greenwood. What does that look like? What is the city of Tulsa doing, in your opinion, to work with Greenwood to address some of the economic blight, the disparities, the inequities that have been outlined in this lawsuit?
Thank you for that wonderful question. I would say that there has been both a historic effort and a contemporary effort to get justice. You mentioned the efforts of your professor, Harvard professor, to win a case in front of the Supreme Court. We've talked about Demario Solomon Simmons and his efforts, and they have stalled out. But I think there is hope in terms of community efforts. There is a Justice for Greenwood effort that Demario Solomon Simmons, who's been representing the survivors, he's a part of. But then there's also a Beyond Apology effort, grassroots effort to get the community, Greenwood residents, as well as the larger Tulsa community, involved in what are the ways in which the race massacre shows up today and how we can deal with it right now as a city. And it appears, this is what I know from just being in conversation with some people who are close, is that it appears that the mayor is supportive of some of the things that the community has highlighted. And so a governor who has, excuse me, not a governor, but a mayor, Tulsa Mayor Bynum, who has called Tulsa the largest crime scene in America because of the massacre. But at the same time, during the massacre, said that it would be better for us to focus on the future and not the past, meaning we shouldn't focus on talking about reparations. Now is saying we could potentially do something. And so I think while there has been deflation, there still is hope, and efforts like Justice for Greenwood and Beyond Apology, trying to move us beyond apologizing for the massacre like we did when the president came in 2021, June, to what can we actually do to address how the legacies of the massacre show up today. That's where the conversation really has to be.
So, Pastor Tony, you were a pastor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is a pretty red state, the state of Oklahoma. You were there for a while. You're now in Baltimore, where you're continuing to do reparations work. You walk to the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, that is once a month, to raise awareness about reparations. You've written a book, your new book out, Creating a Culture of Repair, Taking Action on the Road to Reparations. What differences are you seeing in being now in Baltimore, Maryland, with a governor like Wes Moore, a progressive Democratic governor, versus when you were in Oklahoma? And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how much does the politics, or do the politics of a state, play into what communities can expect when they pursue reparations actions?
Yes, the politics makes a major impact and difference in what is actually done. I think because we all as American citizens and Black folks have suffered, I think the expectation the fight should still be there no matter where you live. I fought very hard in Tulsa. I mean, I went out to City Hall every week for 3 years. That's over 150 plus times in the rain, sleet, hail, and snow. And now in Baltimore, I walk every month, as you stated, from Baltimore to the White House, and in the rain, sleet, hail, and snow as well. But the difference is in leadership. I mean, everything rises and falls with leadership. Just today, we have a governor here in Maryland, Wes Moore, who I just am very, very much so fond of his policies. He just today pardoned 175,000 marijuana convictions. 175,000 people now have gotten, because of his action, will be pardoned who have marijuana convictions. That's huge. And that's an executive order that he is doing. But by extension, I must say, the president, who, and as a pastor, I always tell folks I don't have my church and make any endorsements. But I can tell you, I voted for President Biden in the last election, but he has the power to pass an executive order for HR 40 today. Right. And so that's something that rises and falls with leadership. In Tulsa, the mayor could at any time, city council could at any time pass an ordinance to have reparations. But that now, unfortunately, can't come through the courts. And according to the Supreme Court justice opinion, they left it almost exclusively in the hands of lawmakers. And they knew when they wrote that the lawmakers in that red state were most likely, in large, were not going to support the type of reparations that we were calling for not just the survivors, but as Dr. Hill mentioned, the entire community of Greenwood and their institutions. But that still doesn't mean we should be fighting.
That's a great point, Pastor Turner, that these, in the way that Wes Moore, we talked about that earlier in the show, ensured that 100,000 people with these low-level marijuana charges would have their records cleared so that they would no longer have to worry about renting apartments or signing, checking boxes on job applications. The city council in Tulsa, Professor Hill, what's their position? Because they clearly have power. They have the power to issue either direct payments to citizens that have been impacted. They have the power to make investments in communities that have been impacted as a result of the race massacre. Where do they stand on these issues?
Well, as a body, they haven't been in support of reparations, or else we would have them. But that doesn't mean there can't be more support or unanimous support for them if the mayor has, as he has indicated, is at this point willing to be supportive. So I think the city council might be more supportive with some more supportive mayor and vice versa. But I think failing to see the community as one of the victims and survivors of the massacre is a problem, because we know that there were 300 people who at least were killed, but a community was destroyed. Right? And Pastor Turner can tell a beautiful story about how his church there was an attempt to destroy his church, but his church rebuilt, and there are photos of how the church rebuilt in the sanctuary, right? And so that's what we need to really talk about, because even the church, and Pastor Turner, I want you to talk about this now, still needs repair from the massacre. The basement of the church and other parts of the church. And so that's one of the legacies of the church that reparations could actually go toward, but where is the compassion? So Pastor Turner, can you talk to this, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, hold that thought, Pastor Turner. I definitely want to hear that story. It's a compelling story about the church, because there are cultural institutions that are destroyed. So when we talk about reparative justice work, again, it's not individuals, it's a collective communities across this country that have been destroyed. I also want to talk about the impact that this decision might have on other communities, how it might cause others who were thinking of, taking on this work or taking this work on, might be discouraged by a decision like the Oklahoma Supreme Court in the Tulsa race riot case. So, Pastor Turner, you were at Vernon, this historic Black church in Tulsa, and you discovered its involvement in the race massacre. Tell us how you made that discovery and what it led you to do.
Well, I knew about the massacre when I got there, but I did not know about the church's intimate history and relationship with it. One of the members gave me a tour, and I saw on the cornerstone that the basement was erected and complete in 1919. And the massacre on that same picture, if you look at the bottom right, you will see a granite cornerstone, and it said the sanctuary built in 1928. And I asked, is that the basement that we have Sunday school in? He was like, yeah. I said, do you know what this means? He said, what? I said, it means we have something left. Something that actually was here during the massacre, before the massacre, during the massacre, and after the massacre. Then I went to do a nursing home visit to one of my oldest members, Miss Corbell Shaw, and she informed me that the survivors, who she knew very, very well and very personally, stated that during the massacre, people in Greenwood hid in the church's basement, the same basement that's still standing. And like she was close friends, people like Robert Fairchild, Ernestine Gibbs, all these survivors who were members of Vernon. And when I went into this basement, I noticed that one of the rooms were left pretty much untouched. And that was the room that people hid in. And when we were doing renovation projects throughout the church, I had a construction company come in, and one of the general contractors asked us, when was there a fire in this room? I said, we have not had a fire since the massacre in 1921. I said, why do you ask? Because one of the posts, the concrete was buckling. And he said that only happens under extreme heat when concrete buckles like this. And on top of that, when we did renovation in the restroom, as soon as the subcontractors not bulldoze, but as soon as they broke through the floor in the latest restroom, a mist of smoke comes up. And you can smell it throughout the church. And we pull bricks out of this latest restroom, and they have burn marks on them, right? And we still have those. I placed them in that basement in our library room. And that's a picture that was actually given, a copy of it was given to me, and I left it at the church from our senator, Langford. It was at the Library of Congress, in fact. That's in August of 1921, 2 months after the massacre. And you see the devastation, and you see the men of the church repairing our basement, because we worship in that very space the Sunday following the massacre. In that charred remains, we worshiped in there, and we still have the chairs that we worshiped in. But yes, the church still needs some support to complete the job of renovation. And that is what the city of Tulsa's fire department allowed to happen. That's what the city of Tulsa allowed to happen. That's what the National Guard allowed to happen. That is what Sinclair Oil allowed to happen by them allowing their airplanes to be used. And that's what, yes, the Tulsa Police Department allowed to happen by not going after nor arresting, nor even having an investigation to that gross act of a massacre, arson, murder, kidnapping, and it happened in America.
Yeah, some of these acts, Professor Hill, are so heinous that it's even hard to imagine that they really happened. When I look at what happened in 1950s and 60s Palm Springs, California, it's really hard to imagine that a city government or a city fire department, like Pastor Turner just talked about, will be engaged in this level of destruction. But this was the era. This was, coming out of Jim Crowism. This is America. its disdain and its hatred for Black people, the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Acts and all these things that were designed to make us, equal citizens and provide protection under the law in the same way as white citizens have always had in this country, continues to this day to be just a very elusive concept in many ways. And we're seeing attacks on reparations actions. A lawsuit's been filed against the city of Evanston that had one of the first widespread reparations programs to address redlining and other discriminatory housing practices in that city. And it's my belief that there are elements out there, Republicans, extremists, that want to conflate reparations, reparative justice work, DEI, critical race theory, affirmative action, and create it, ball them all up together and make them the enemy, make them the boogeyman, make them the subject of culture wars, and cause Black people to be afraid to assert their rights, and for white people to become emboldened to say all of that's bad, that ball is bad. How do we fight back against that? Because this is a devastating blow, not just to those plaintiffs in that lawsuit, but to the reparations movement that's happening around this country.
Areva, I'm going to turn on my microphone this time. Areva,
Appreciate it.
I think what you put your finger on is correct. There's an effort to really flatten, and in flattening, simplify, and in simplifying, make everything sound and look the same. DEI, reparations, it's all the same. We should be opposed to it because they're asking for things that we are not responsible for. It is not our responsibility for slavery. It's not our responsibility for the race massacre. But all that is bundling up indifference to Black suffering, whether it's today or yesterday. It's just the same old indifference to Black suffering, violence that happens to Black people, harm that happens to Black people. We don't have any sympathy for. Black life was cheap. You mentioned Jim Crow. It was cheap during Jim Crow. It's still cheap in 2024 because we can't force justice for glaring injustice. And so what do? We have to force people to care and to be compassionate. And that's why I always talk about the war that we're fighting is for trying to get people to be compassionate and not indifferent to Black suffering.
Yeah, just real quickly, Pastor Turner, Native American tribes, big in Oklahoma, lots of indigenous people. And we know there have been efforts over the last 10 years, really prominent efforts of Native Americans to reclaim hundreds of acres of ancestral land. It's been taking them decades and decades of advocacy. But do you see the same pushback on indigenous people as they seek to reclaim their land?
No, not at all. And in fact, the indigenous tribes, particularly in Oklahoma, the 5 civilized tribes, they own enslaved people as well. And they have yet to pay reparations. In fact, some of the tribes do not even want to consider their descendants of the freedmen as citizens of the tribe. So there's a lawsuit now.
Yeah, that's a great big conversation. And I asked for you right as we're out of time. But I just want to thank both of you. Got to have you back to have that conversation because I'm just seeing all these articles of indigenous tribes reclaiming hundreds and hundreds of acres across this country, and not wishing anybody any ill will. But we've got to talk about African Americans and our efforts, how they stack up against these other ethnic groups. Creating a culture of repair. Make sure you pick up the book by Pastor Robert Turner,